The storm began to brew on the third night of the voyage. A once calm and luxurious cruise turned into something out of a nightmare as the sea roared with an unnatural fury. The Pacific Monarch, a towering vessel with grand dining halls and endless entertainment, became a prison of terror as the ship plunged into darkness. Passengers were gathered in the atrium when the lights first flickered. A woman screamed as the chandelier swayed ominously overhead, casting fractured shadows on the walls. The crew reassured everyone it was a minor electrical issue, but their eyes betrayed their words. Something was off. Whispers of unease spread like wildfire, fueled by the mysterious disappearance of an elderly man just the day before. He had simply vanished, leaving nothing behind but a half-empty glass on the deck. As the night wore on, the storm intensified. Waves crashed against the hull, causing the ship to groan like a living creature in pain. Passengers huddled together in their cabins, clutching onto anything that would keep them grounded. It was then that the oddities began in earnest. From the upper decks, some reported hearing faint music. Not the lively jazz tunes that usually filled the air, but something eerie, old gramophone melodies warped by static. One passenger claimed to have seen a woman in a flowing white dress walking along the promenade deck, her hair billowing as if caught in an unseen wind. When he called out to her, she turned, revealing hollow eyes and a twisted smile before dissolving into the mist. In the dining room, staff found an elaborate feast set out on the tables, even though the kitchen had been closed for hours. Plates of food steamed as if freshly prepared, but no one could explain who had made them. One crew member, a young dishwasher, dared to taste a morsel. Moments later, he collapsed, convulsing violently before going still. His lips curled into an unnatural grin as blood seeped from his ears. Panic erupted. People demanded answers, but the captain was nowhere to be found. Rumors spread that he had locked himself in his quarters, ranting about a curse. Some passengers began to recall hearing stories about the Pacific Monarch during its maiden voyage decades ago. A tragedy, they said. A young bride had gone overboard on her wedding night, though some believed she had been pushed. Her body was never recovered, and whispers of her haunting the ship had persisted ever since. By the fourth night, the ship seemed to take on a life of its own. Doors slammed shut without warning, trapping passengers inside rooms or out in the hallways. Shadows moved in ways that defied logic, stretching and contorting along the walls. A child claimed a man with no face had visited his room, standing silently by his bed until he screamed. The climax came just after midnight. The ship's horn blared, a deafening sound that reverberated through every corner of the vessel. Passengers who ventured onto the decks were met with a horrifying sight. The sea itself appeared to be rising, forming shapes that looked disturbingly human. They reached for the ship with waterlogged hands, pulling at its edges as if trying to drag it under. Inside, the grand staircase filled with water that seemed to come from nowhere. Passengers scrambled for higher ground, only to find the ship was closing in on them. Hallways narrowed, ceilings lowered, and every turn led to a dead end. It was as if the Pacific Monarch had become a labyrinth designed to entrap its prey. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The ship was found drifting in calm waters 2 days later, eerily silent. A rescue team boarded to find no trace of the passengers or crew. The dining room still held the untouched feast, and the cabins looked as if their occupants had simply stepped out for a moment. To this day, the Pacific Monarch floats aimlessly, a ghost ship that no one dares to claim. Sailors speak of spotting it under moonlit skies, its lights faintly glowing as a waltz echoes across the waves. Those who get too close say they hear faint whispers calling them aboard, promising a voyage like no other, if they dare.
Story number 2.
The ship was called Eternal Dawn, a fitting name for a vessel that promised endless sunlit horizons and carefree days at sea. But what the passengers didn't know was that this particular voyage was cursed before it even began. It started subtly. On the first night, a passenger reported strange thumping noises coming from below deck. The crew dismissed it as the engine, normal sounds of a ship. But the man insisted it wasn't mechanical. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone, or something, knocking from the depths. By the second day, whispers began circulating among the passengers. A young woman claimed to have seen someone standing on the deck in the dead of night. A man dressed in outdated clothing, staring out at the horizon. She approached him, asking if he was all right, but he turned, revealing a face pale as death and eyes that seemed to glow faintly red. She screamed, waking half the ship, but when others arrived, there was no one there. That same day, the ship's intercom crackled to life without warning. Instead of announcements or cheerful music, it broadcast garbled voices. The static was punctuated by faint crying and what sounded like screams muffled by water. The captain assured everyone it was a technical glitch, but his trembling hands betrayed him. As night fell, the eternal dawn sailed into a dense fog that seemed to swallow the world. Visibility dropped to nothing, and the air grew icy cold. Passengers huddled in their cabins, but sleep didn't come easily. Throughout the night, the knocking from below intensified. It echoed through the walls, rattling doors and shaking mirrors. A group of teenagers, emboldened by curiosity, decided to explore. Armed with flashlights, they ventured into the lower decks. They found a hatch that led to a part of the ship marked as restricted. Inside was a storage area filled with rusted tools and old crates. One of the girls noticed an odd stain on the floor, a dark, sticky residue. As she bent down to touch it, a whisper filled the room. "Get out!" The flashlight beams flickered, and the door slammed shut behind them. The whispers turned into guttural growls, and one of the boys swore he saw a shadow move, a tall figure with impossibly long arms slithering toward them. They screamed and pounded on the door until another passenger heard them and pulled them out. When asked what they saw, none of them could explain it coherently, but all agreed on one thing. Something was down there. On the third night, chaos erupted. A passenger was found in the pool, face down. At first, it was thought to be an accident, but when they turned him over, his eyes were wide open and his lips were twisted into a grotesque smile. His fingernails were torn as if he tried to claw at something, someone, before he drowned. Then the power failed. The ship plunged into darkness, save for the dim emergency lights casting long, eerie shadows. The fog outside crept into the ship, seeping through cracks and vents, filling the hallways with a cold, damp mist. Passengers swore they heard voices calling their names from the fog, luring them toward the decks. One by one, people began disappearing. A mother searching for her child. A man investigating a strange noise outside his cabin. They simply vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of seawater and a sense of utter despair. The remaining passengers banded together in the main dining hall, barricading the doors. They huddled around candles, their fear palpable. Outside, the knocking grew louder, now accompanied by wet, dragging sounds. Something, or many somethings, was moving through the ship. A brave crew member decided to confront whatever was happening. Armed with a fire axe, he ventured toward the engine room, where the sounds seemed to originate. Hours passed, and he never returned. Later, his axe was found lodged in a steel wall, bent as if it had struck something far harder than metal. As dawn approached, the survivors noticed the ship had stopped moving. Through the fog, they saw land, a jagged, rocky shoreline that looked anything but inviting. They decided to abandon ship, piling into lifeboats with what little they could carry. But as they lowered the boats, they saw figures emerging from the mist. Pale, skeletal beings with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. They reached for the lifeboats, their mouths opening in silent screams. One by one, the boats capsized, their occupants dragged into the freezing water. Only one survivor lived to tell the tale. He was found days later drifting on a makeshift raft, dehydrated and delirious. When rescuers asked him what had happened, he could only whisper 2 words before collapsing. They wait. The eternal dawn was never found, and sailors say the area where it vanished is cursed. On foggy nights, ships passing through report hearing faint knocking sounds from below their decks, as if the lost souls of the eternal dawn are still searching for escape.
Story number 3.
The Mariana Star was a luxury cruise ship celebrated for its opulence, promising passengers a journey through the most picturesque seas. On its final voyage, it was meant to chart a course across the Pacific, stopping at remote islands where only a privileged few had ventured. But none who boarded could have foreseen the horrors that lay ahead. The trouble began on the second day at sea. A strange fog enveloped the ship out of nowhere, thick and unrelenting, despite clear forecasts. It hung low and heavy, muffling sound and obscuring the horizon. The captain assured everyone it was a natural phenomenon, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. Some passengers claimed to hear faint whispers within the fog, though no one could agree on what the voices were saying. That night, the first incident occurred. A cabin steward found an elderly woman sitting motionless on her bed, staring at the wall. When he asked if she needed help, she turned her head slowly and murmured, "He's coming for us. We should never have come here." When the steward tried to guide her to the infirmary, she let out an ear-piercing scream and collapsed. By the time the ship's doctor arrived, she was dead. Her body was ice cold, though the ship's heating system was functioning normally. The next morning, her cabin was sealed, but passengers nearby reported hearing footsteps pacing inside. One woman claimed to hear a faint knock on her door in the middle of the night. When she opened it, no one was there, just the lingering scent of seawater. By the third day, things escalated. The ship's navigation systems malfunctioned. The crew insisted they were working on it, but whispers spread among the passengers. The Mariana Star was off course. Some people claimed to have seen shapes moving in the water, large, dark figures that seemed to follow the ship just beneath the surface. In the dining hall that evening, a man stood up suddenly and began shouting about shadows watching him from the corners of the room. He clawed at his own eyes, screaming about needing to block them out before collapsing to the floor. His heart had stopped, but no cause could be determined. The lights in the dining hall flickered violently, plunging the room into brief, oppressive darkness. When the lights stabilized, a message was found scratched into one of the mirrors. "Turn back." The passengers demanded answers, but the captain was evasive. He avoided eye contact, and his hands shook as he gripped the rail of the bridge. That night, the fog thickened again, and the ocean grew eerily calm. No waves, no breeze, only silence. It was unnatural, and everyone on board felt it. In the dead of night, a terrible sound echoed through the ship. It was a low, guttural moan, rising to a deafening wail. Passengers rushed from their cabins, only to find that the hallways seemed different. They stretched on longer than before, with doors that didn't lead to where they should. Some hallways looped back on themselves, trapping people in an endless maze. The ship itself seemed to warp, as if alive. The most chilling discovery came in the morning. The lifeboats were gone. Not a trace of them remained, though no alarms had sounded, and no one had heard anything. Panic set in as the passengers realized they were completely stranded. By the fifth day, the Mariana Star was a ghost ship. More passengers vanished overnight. The remaining survivors barricaded themselves in the grand ballroom, but it was no refuge. The floor began to vibrate, and a deep rumbling sound filled the room. From the ceiling, water began to drip, slow at first, then in torrents. The ballroom flooded within minutes, but the water wasn't normal. It was thick, dark, and carried the stench of decay. Amid the chaos, those still alive saw them, figures emerging from the water, humanoid but wrong. Their faces were blank slates, featureless and smooth, and their limbs moved unnaturally. They reached for the passengers with outstretched hands, pulling them into the black water one by one. When the Mariana Star was discovered weeks later, it was adrift, its decks eerily quiet. The rescue team found no signs of life, but the ship's interior was damp and smelled of the sea. Every clock on board had stopped at precisely 3:17 a.m., the same moment the last distress signal had been sent, a garbled message that ended with a single word, "Beware." To this day, no one knows what happened to the passengers and crew. The Mariana Star remains quarantined in a secure naval facility, but sailors swear that if you get close enough, you can still hear the faint sounds of footsteps and whispers calling from somewhere deep within.
Story number 4.
The Ocean's Veil was a smaller, boutique cruise ship, renowned for its intimate voyages and secluded routes. The trip promised passengers an exclusive journey through uncharted waters, past ancient, uninhabited islands. The allure of mystery and exclusivity drew only the wealthiest and most adventurous souls. But as the voyage progressed, it became clear that some waters were meant to remain untouched. It began innocently enough. The ship departed under clear skies and calm seas, the passengers enjoying champagne on the deck as the sun set. That first night, the crew noticed something odd. The navigation systems briefly malfunctioned, flickering to static before resetting. The captain, an experienced mariner, dismissed it as interference and continued the course. The second night, the air grew strangely cold. A dense mist rolled in without warning, blanketing the ship in an eerie silence. Passengers on the upper deck reported hearing faint whispers coming from the fog. One woman claimed she heard her late husband's voice calling her name. though she was too frightened to investigate. At dinner, the atmosphere grew tense. Several guests noted a strange metallic taste in their food, though the chefs insisted everything was freshly prepared. A man in a tailored suit excused himself from the table, clutching his throat. When the staff found him minutes later, he was slumped in a hallway, his face frozen in terror. There were no visible injuries, but his fingernails were broken, as though he'd clawed at the walls. The captain ordered the crew to double-check the ship's navigation. They discovered the ocean's veil had veered miles off course, drifting into waters not marked on any chart. Attempts to reset the course failed. The compass spun wildly, and the GPS displayed only static. The third night was when the real horror began. The ship drifted into the shadow of an island, a jagged silhouette against the moonlight. The captain insisted it wasn't on any map. A strange unease settled over the passengers as they stared at the island. Its shoreline seemed to pulse, like the breathing of a living thing. Despite the captain's orders to avoid it, the ocean's veil seemed drawn toward the island. No matter how hard the engines pushed in the opposite direction, the ship inched closer. That night, several passengers reported hearing scratching noises outside their cabin doors. One man, unable to sleep, opened his door to investigate and found a trail of wet footprints leading down the hall. He followed them to the grand staircase, where they abruptly ended in a pool of dark water. In the early hours of the morning, a crew member spotted something on the deck. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, stood at the edge, facing the sea. Its body was unnaturally bent, its head tilted at an angle that seemed to defy anatomy. When the crew member called out, the figure slowly turned, revealing hollow, empty eyes and a mouth that opened wider than humanly possible. It let out a sound, a low, resonant hum that rattled the windows before stepping off the edge and disappearing into the water. Panic spread like wildfire. Passengers locked themselves in their cabins, but it didn't matter. Throughout the night, the ship groaned and creaked, as though something massive was pressing against its hull. Some swore they saw shapes moving just beneath the waterline, shadows with too many limbs and eyes that glimmered faintly in the dark. By dawn, the ocean's veil had stopped moving entirely. The engines had failed, and the ship sat motionless in a sea that looked more like ink than water. The island loomed closer now, its rocky surface covered in strange, pulsating growths that oozed a sickly green light. The captain, desperate to save his passengers, organized an evacuation. But as the lifeboats were lowered, the water began to churn violently. Dark tendrils emerged, slick and glistening, wrapping around the boats and dragging them under. The screams of those on board echoed across the ship, then were silenced. Inside, the remaining passengers gathered in the ballroom, clutching whatever weapons they could find. The lights flickered, and the temperature plummeted. A guttural, rasping voice echoed through the room, speaking in a language no one understood. The walls began to bleed a dark, tar-like substance, and the air filled with the smell of decay. The final hours of the ocean's veil are pieced together only from fragments found later. A distress call, garbled and distorted, repeated the same phrase over and over. It watches. It waits. It feeds. The ship was discovered weeks later, drifting aimlessly. Every cabin was empty, every lifeboat accounted for, but no passengers or crew remained. The interior was coated in a thin layer of salt, and the ballroom was filled with barnacles and seaweed, as though it had been submerged for decades. The ocean's veil was towed to shore, but no one dared board it. Some say on foggy nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint whispers of those who were lost, calling for help from the endless, unknowable depths.
Story number 5.
The cruise ship Sapphire Horizon was the epitome of luxury. Its maiden voyage promised to be an unforgettable experience, whisking passengers away to exotic destinations under starry skies. But none of the guests or crew could have anticipated how unforgettable it would truly become. The journey started without incident. Passengers lounged by the pool, sipped cocktails, and danced under the moonlight. The ship sailed smoothly through calm waters until the fourth night, when something changed. It started with a strange announcement over the intercom. The voice wasn't the usual cheerful tone of the cruise director. It was distorted, low, and crackling. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. The announcement ended abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. That evening, the ship sailed into a dense, unnatural fog. It was so thick that visibility dropped to zero, and the usual hum of the engine seemed muted. The air grew damp and cold, carrying a faint metallic smell that clung to everything. Passengers joked nervously about it being like a scene from a horror movie, but their laughter didn't last long. Around midnight, strange sounds began to echo through the ship. Low, guttural groans, like the creaking of an ancient shipwreck, reverberated through the walls. Some passengers reported hearing soft weeping in the hallways, but when they looked, no one was there. The crew insisted everything was fine, but their pale faces told a different story. By the next morning, the fog still hadn't lifted. A sense of unease gripped the ship as passengers noticed small, unsettling details. The clocks in the dining hall all stopped at exactly 2:13 a.m. Mirrors in the bathrooms showed faint, shadowy figures that weren't there when you turned around, and the once friendly crew now avoided eye contact, speaking only in hushed tones. That afternoon, the ship's systems began failing. Lights flickered, the elevator stopped working, and the ship's navigation equipment went haywire. The captain, a seasoned sailor with decades of experience, admitted they were lost. They had no idea where the Sapphire Horizon was or how to get back on course. That night, chaos erupted. The ship's horn blared, deafeningly loud, jolting everyone awake. Passengers poured out of their cabins, only to find the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Doors led to the wrong rooms, and some opened into pitch-black voids filled with the sound of crashing waves. In the main atrium, a group of passengers gathered, hoping for answers. That's when they saw it. Through the glass doors leading to the outer deck, something moved in the fog. It was massive, its silhouette barely discernible through the mist. It didn't look like a whale or any other sea creature they had seen. Its form was wrong, angular and jagged, with two limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The ship began to shudder violently, as if something enormous was brushing against its hull. Passengers screamed as the lights went out completely. In the darkness, whispers filled the air, a chorus of voices speaking in an ancient, guttural language. Some swore the voices called their names, luring them toward the decks. When the lights flickered back on, several passengers were missing. Their belongings were untouched, but they were simply gone. Others were found cowering in corners, their eyes wide and unseeing, mumbling about the eyes in the fog and the thing in the water. By the sixth day, the remaining passengers barricaded themselves in the theater, hoping to wait out whatever was happening. The crew had all vanished, and the captain's quarters were locked from the inside. Those who peered through the keyhole saw only darkness, though some swore they could hear faint breathing on the other side. The end came quietly. Those who survived to the final night reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the ship itself was alive and angry. The fog seeped into the theater, filling the room with a bone-chilling cold. One by one, the passengers fell silent, their faces frozen in expressions of terror as the fog consumed them. The Sapphire Horizon was discovered weeks later, adrift in calm waters. The ship was eerily intact, but not a single soul remained on board. Every clock had stopped at 2:13 a.m., and the dining hall mirrors were shattered. Rescue teams reported hearing faint whispers as they explored the ship, though they found no source. The Sapphire Horizon was eventually scuttled, sunk to the depths of the ocean. But sailors claim that, on foggy nights, a faint horn can still be heard in the distance, followed by the echo of ghostly whispers, warning all who listen to stay away.
Story number 6.
The Celestial Wave was a high-end cruise liner known for its grand voyages across the Arctic Circle, giving passengers a rare chance to witness the northern lights from the sea. The ship promised luxury, adventure, and breathtaking views of the natural world. But on its final journey, it delivered something no one had ever seen before, and no one lived to tell the tale. The voyage began as planned, with clear skies and calm seas. Guests marveled at the icy landscapes and watched the aurora borealis shimmer across the night sky. Spirits were high, and the crew maintained their usual professionalism, attending to every need. But on the fourth night, as the ship crossed an uncharted fjord, the auroras shifted. The vibrant greens and purples twisted into unnatural patterns, resembling symbols and shapes that seemed almost purposeful. That was when the ship's power inexplicably failed. Lights flickered and went out, plunging the Celestial Wave into darkness. The engines groaned and sputtered before going silent. Outside, the auroras grew brighter, bathing the deck in an eerie, pulsating glow. Passengers crowded the railings, captivated by the spectacle, until someone screamed. A man pointed at the water below. The surface, which should have been dark and calm, was glowing faintly, revealing something massive moving just beneath. Its shape was indistinct, but it was clear that it was larger than the ship, with undulating limbs that seemed to stretch endlessly into the depths. The crew scrambled to restore power, but every attempt failed. The captain ordered the lifeboats prepared, though launching them into the icy waters seemed like a last resort. Meanwhile, strange occurrences began to spread through the ship. Passengers reported hearing voices, not human voices, but low, resonant murmurs that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Others claimed to see shadowy figures standing at the edge of the auroras, watching silently. In one of the lounges, a group of passengers gathered for safety. Suddenly, the glass windows overlooking the deck cracked violently, though there was no impact. A gust of freezing wind blew through the room, extinguishing candles and sending papers flying. When the lights briefly flickered back on, one of the passengers was missing. The only sign of him was a single wet footprint leading toward the shattered window. Below deck, crew members investigating the engine room found something horrifying. The machinery was intact, but a thick, dark substance like tar coated every surface. It pulsated as if alive and emitted a faint, otherworldly hum. One crew member touched it and immediately began convulsing, his eyes rolling back as he muttered phrases in an unknown language. He died within minutes, his body bloated and cold as ice. As the hours passed, the celestial wave drifted further into the fjord. The auroras above twisted and churned, casting strange, shifting shadows across the ship. The passengers and remaining crew huddled together in the dining hall, but safety was an illusion. The whispers grew louder, now interspersed with high-pitched wails that sounded like screams carried on the wind. A brave few ventured back to the deck, desperate to signal for help with flares. What they saw froze them in place. The massive shape beneath the water was rising. It broke the surface, revealing a titanic form that defied comprehension. Its body was a writhing mass of tendrils and jagged, crystalline structures that refracted the aurora's light into blinding beams. At its center was a single, massive eye, unblinking and glowing with an unnatural light. The tendrils reached up, wrapping around the ship's hull. Passengers screamed as the celestial wave tilted violently, the deck becoming a chaotic swirl of sliding bodies and shattered furniture. Those who fell into the icy water were dragged under almost instantly, their screams cut short by the freezing depths or by something else. Inside, the ship's walls began to warp, twisting and pulsing like living flesh. Passengers and crew ran in all directions, only to find that the corridors no longer led to where they should. Some found themselves back in rooms they'd never entered, while others opened doors that led directly into the freezing sea. The end came quickly. The auroras above intensified, spiraling into a vortex that seemed to pierce the heavens. The creature pulled the celestial wave under, its massive tendrils crushing the hull like paper. The last thing anyone saw was the eye, vast, unblinking, and filled with an incomprehensible intelligence, watching as the ship disappeared beneath the waves. Weeks later, pieces of the celestial wave were found washed ashore on distant Arctic coasts. The metal was warped and corroded as though it had been underwater for centuries. No bodies were ever recovered, but those who visited the wreckage reported feeling a profound sense of unease, as if something ancient and malevolent was still watching. To this day, sailors avoid that fjord, calling it the Eye's Abyss. On cold, clear nights, some claim they can see the auroras twisting into impossible shapes and hear faint whispers carried on the wind, warning all who venture near, "Leave us be."
Story number 7.
The Elysian Tide was a cruise ship famed for its moonlit voyages through the Caribbean. Lavish parties, endless buffets, and the soothing rhythm of the waves were its signature offerings. But one voyage would cement its name in legend, whispered among sailors as a cautionary tale. It was a chartered trip for an exclusive clientele, a mysterious group of individuals who called themselves the Horizon Society. No one on the crew knew much about them, only that they were wealthy and had booked the entire ship for a private gathering. Rumors circulated among the staff. Some said they were eccentric collectors, others claimed they were reclusive scientists. From the outset, the voyage was strange. The Horizon Society brought aboard several large, unmarked crates, insisting they be stored in the ballroom under lock and key. The crew wasn't allowed inside while the group conducted their ceremony. A few curious crew members swore they heard chanting coming from the room late at night, but no one dared investigate. On the third evening, the society requested that the ship change course, steering toward an uncharted region of the sea. The captain, reluctant but bound by contract, complied. The guests gathered on the top deck, gazing into the horizon as if searching for something. The crew overheard snippets of conversation about the veil and the awakening, but the passengers offered no explanations. As night fell, the sky darkened unnaturally. Clouds rolled in, heavy and foreboding, despite clear forecasts. The stars disappeared, and the moonlight turned a sickly shade of green. The ocean itself seemed to change, its surface unnervingly still. The Elysian tide floated in eerie silence, broken only by the occasional splash of water as if something enormous was swimming beneath them. Then the storm hit. It wasn't like any storm the crew had encountered before. The winds screamed, carrying with them faint whispers in a language no one could understand. The rain was thick and stung like needles. The ship's instruments malfunctioned, compasses spinning wildly, and radios emitting bursts of static interspersed with faint, otherworldly voices. In the ballroom the Horizon Society had gathered, the crates now opened to reveal strange ancient artifacts. One crew member who peered inside described them as impossible objects, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and twist in ways that defied physics. He ran back to the deck, screaming about holes in the air and shadows that moved against the walls. The passengers, those not part of the society, were confined to their cabins, but many reported seeing unsettling things. One woman claimed her mirror reflected a figure standing behind her, though her cabin door was locked. Another passenger heard a voice calling her name from the air vent, though it sounded like her deceased brother. The storm reached its crescendo at midnight. The chanting from the ballroom grew louder, blending with the thunder and the crashing waves. Suddenly, a deafening guttural roar echoed across the ship. The sea churned violently, and a massive whirlpool began forming off the starboard side. From its depths rose something that should not have existed, a structure, black and glistening, shaped like a jagged tower. It seemed to pulsate, alive and ancient, its surface covered in glowing runes that burned into the mind when stared at too long. The Horizon Society cheered, but their triumph was short-lived. From the tower came creatures, impossible forms that seemed to exist halfway between dimensions. Their bodies were indistinct, constantly shifting between solid and shadow. They moved with a grotesque elegance, slipping through walls and ceilings as if the ship's structure didn't apply to them. The creatures descended upon the ship, targeting passengers and crew alike. Those who were caught didn't scream. They simply vanished, their bodies folding into themselves like collapsing paper. The lucky ones fled to the upper decks, only to find the storm had intensified. The sea was alive now, writhing and roaring, with massive tentacles breaching the surface and slamming against the ship's hull. The Elysian tide began to sink, pulled toward the whirlpool and the looming tower. The surviving crew and passengers scrambled for lifeboats, but the sea seemed intent on claiming them all. One by one, the lifeboats were overturned, their occupants dragged screaming into the depths. In the final moments, those still aboard saw the Horizon Society gathered at the bow, their faces alight with mad devotion. They raised their arms toward the tower, shouting praises to something unseen. Then the ship tilted sharply, plunging stern first into the churning abyss. The Elysian tide was never seen again. Months later, pieces of debris washed ashore on distant islands, but no bodies were recovered. Fishermen in the area claim the waters where the ship disappeared are cursed. On moonless nights, they say, you can still hear faint chanting carried on the wind, and sometimes, when the sea is calm, you might glimpse the top of a black tower rising briefly from the waves before sinking back into the depths. No one sails those waters anymore. They call it the Drowning Veil, a place where the line between reality and nightmare thins, and those who venture too close are never the same, if they return at all.
Story number 8.
The Starlight Majestic was hailed as the crown jewel of luxury cruises, a floating paradise promising 7 days of opulence under the open sky. Its highlight was the Starlight Observatory, a glass-domed deck where passengers could stargaze in perfect clarity. The ship's maiden voyage was fully booked, with a mix of honeymooners, families, and wealthy travelers eager for an unforgettable experience. They got their wish. The journey began smoothly. The first 3 nights were magical, with clear skies and constellations glittering above. On the 4th night, however, a peculiar phenomenon occurred. As the ship glided through open waters, the stars seemed to shift unnaturally. Passengers lounging in the observatory noticed constellations they didn't recognize, patterns that didn't exist on any chart. A young astronomer on board grew visibly alarmed, muttering about celestial anomalies that shouldn't be possible. Later that evening, the Starlight Majestic crossed into a dense patch of fog. The captain assured everyone it was a routine occurrence, but the fog didn't dissipate. Instead, it grew thicker, enveloping the ship in a heavy, suffocating blanket. The stars disappeared, leaving the passengers in an eerie gray void. The ship's navigation systems faltered, and the crew could no longer determine their location. Then, the noises began. At first, they were faint, a distant hum that could be dismissed as the engines. But as the hours passed, the sounds grew louder, taking on a rhythmic, almost melodic quality. It was unlike anything anyone had ever heard, a haunting harmony that seemed to echo from the fog itself. Passengers complained of headaches and dizziness, and some began to hear whispers, soft and unintelligible, as if someone or something was speaking just beyond their comprehension. The ship's clock stopped at exactly 2:47 a.m. That's when the power failed. The lights flickered, dimmed, and finally went out, plunging the Starlight Majestic into darkness. Panic spread as passengers groped their way through the corridors. Emergency lights flickered sporadically, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to move on their own. Crew members attempted to keep order, but they were just as terrified as the passengers. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, instructing everyone to remain calm and stay in their cabins. But many ignored the advice, gathering in common areas where they felt less isolated. It didn't help. By the 5th night, people started disappearing. The first was a young couple last seen in the observatory. Their belongings were untouched, their drinks still on the table, but they were gone. Later, a steward went to check on an elderly woman who hadn't left her cabin, only to find the room empty. Her cane was propped against the bed, and her shoes were still neatly placed by the door. Strange symbols began to appear on the walls, intricate patterns that seemed etched into the metal. They pulsed faintly, emitting a soft glow that made people nauseous if they stared too long. The whispers grew louder, morphing into a cacophony of voices, speaking in unison. Some passengers claimed they could understand fragments of the words, phrases like crossing the veil and the eternal watchers. On the final night, the ship's radar detected a massive structure in the fog. It was impossible. There were no islands or land masses on their charts, but the readings were undeniable. The fog began to part, revealing an immense black spire rising out of the sea. Its surface was smooth and reflective, but looking into it felt wrong, as though it were staring back. Passengers and crew alike were drawn to the deck, unable to tear their eyes away from the spire. The whispers became a deafening roar, and the sea around the ship began to churn violently. From the spire came figures, tall, gaunt shapes cloaked in shadow, their features obscured. They walked across the water as if it were solid ground, moving in unison toward the ship. Chaos erupted. People ran in every direction, screaming and scrambling to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The figures reached the ship, stepping aboard without a sound. They moved with an unnatural grace, gliding through walls and closed doors. Those they touched vanished instantly, leaving behind only faint impressions in the air, like heat waves. The last radio transmission from the Starlight Majestic came at 3:13 a.m. It consisted of static, interspersed with fragments of a single sentence. "We opened the sky, and they came." When the ship was finally found, it was drifting silently, its engines cold. Every cabin was empty, every deck deserted. There were no signs of struggle, no bodies, and no clues as to what had happened. The symbols on the walls were gone, and the fog had lifted. The ship was pristine, as though it had been waiting for its next voyage. The Starlight Majestic was towed back to port, but no one dared board it again. To this day, it sits in a private dock, locked and abandoned. On clear nights, locals say they can see faint lights flickering in the observatory. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint hum of that otherworldly melody, beckoning you to come closer.
Story number 9.
The Ocean's Requiem was a sleek, state-of-the-art research vessel chartered for an expedition to explore the depths of the Mariana Trench. Among its crew were world-renowned marine biologists, geologists, and deep-sea explorers, all eager to uncover secrets from the uncharted abyss. The ship carried advanced submersibles and equipment designed to withstand the immense pressure of the trench. What they found there was something no one could have prepared for. The first 2 days of the expedition were uneventful. The crew mapped the seafloor, discovered unique thermal vents, and observed bizarre deep-sea creatures. Spirits were high as the team prepared to lower their flagship submersible, the Abyssal Diver, into the deepest point of the trench. The dive went smoothly until the submersible reached a depth of 10,000 meters. That's when the signals began. At first, it was a rhythmic ping, much like the kind submarines use for navigation. The sound grew louder, more insistent, almost like a heartbeat. The crew dismissed it as a geological anomaly, perhaps caused by shifting tectonic plates. But the pattern was too precise, too deliberate. It was as if something was calling to them. When the submersible's cameras went live, they revealed a sight that left the crew speechless. The trench floor wasn't just barren rock and silt. It was covered in what appeared to be ruins. Gigantic angular structures rose from the seafloor, their surfaces encrusted with strange, glowing algae. The architecture was alien, defying human understanding of geometry and design. It was as if the buildings had been crafted by something that saw the world in dimensions beyond the human eye. The crew of the Abyssal Diver reported feeling uneasy, as though they were being watched. Then the lights of the ruins flickered. At first, it seemed random, but soon it became clear the lights were blinking in a sequence, like a signal or a warning. The submersible's sonar picked up movement. Something massive was stirring in the darkness. The crew strained to make sense of the blurry sonar images. A shape so large, it dwarfed the Abyssal Diver. Its body was a writhing mass of tentacles and jagged fins with eyes that glowed faintly in the murky water. The crew aboard the Ocean's Requiem listened in horror as the submersible's pilot, a seasoned deep-sea explorer, began screaming about mouths within mouths and a city built to keep it asleep. Then the transmission cut out. Desperate, the ship's crew attempted to retrieve the Abyssal Diver, but the winch jammed as if something was pulling against it. Moments later, the submersible's cable snapped. The Abyssal Diver and its 3 crew members were lost to the trench. The ocean around the ship grew unnaturally still. The rhythmic pinging they had heard earlier returned, now louder and closer. It vibrated through the hull, rattling equipment and setting teeth on edge. The remaining scientists scrambled to analyze the sound, only to discover it wasn't geological, it was biological. Whatever was making the sound was alive, and it was moving toward them. Panic set in as the Ocean's Requiem tried to leave the area. The engines roared to life, but the ship wouldn't move. The water around the vessel had thickened, almost gelatinous, trapping the ship like an insect in amber. Crew members who peered overboard screamed in terror. The water beneath them was filled with glowing eyes and pulsating shapes, pressing against the ship's hull as though studying it. The lights on the Ocean's Requiem flickered, then went out entirely. In the pitch darkness, the crew heard scraping sounds, long, deliberate strokes of something dragging along the hull. Then came the whispers. They weren't in any human language, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, probing, hungry. One by one, crew members began to disappear. First, the biologist who went to secure the specimens. Then the engineer who tried to fix the failing generators. Each time, there was no sign of a struggle, just the lingering echo of those incomprehensible whispers. The remaining crew locked themselves in the control room, frantically sending distress signals. Hours passed with no response. Then, the captain noticed something on the sonar. A shape, impossibly large, rising from the trench below them. The ruins had been a prison, not a city, and they had woken its prisoner. The creature breached the surface in a violent eruption of water. Its form was a nightmare of twisting limbs, eyes that burned like molten fire, and a gaping maw that seemed to suck in the very light around it. The whispers turned into a deafening roar as the creature loomed over the ship. The final transmission from the Ocean's Requiem was a single word, repeated over and over by a voice trembling with terror. Run. The ship was found weeks later, adrift in the Pacific. Every inch of its surface was covered in strange markings, as though carved by enormous claws. The interior was pristine, but there was no sign of the crew. The only clue was the ship's log, which ended abruptly with the words, "It was never meant to be found." To this day, no one knows what truly happened in the trench. The area is marked as a no-sail zone, and those who venture too close report hearing faint whispers carried on the wind, accompanied by the rhythmic sound of something vast and ancient stirring in the depths.
Story number 10.
The Midnight Seraph was a boutique cruise ship, smaller than the massive liners that typically cross the oceans, but prized for its exclusivity and intimacy. Its allure was the promise of a tranquil, moonlit journey through remote parts of the Atlantic, far from the crowded tourist routes. The voyage was marketed as a retreat for those seeking solitude and serenity. What the passengers found instead was something far darker. The voyage began with 20 guests and a skeleton crew of 10. The ship departed from Iceland, heading toward the Faroe Islands, before looping back to its origin. For the first 2 nights, the Midnight Seraph delivered exactly what it promised: calm seas, breathtaking views of the aurora borealis, and the soothing silence of the open ocean. On the 3rd night, a storm rolled in. The skies turned an oppressive shade of gray, and the wind howled with a ferocity that seemed to shake the ship to its core. Waves slammed against the hull, sending sprays of freezing seawater across the deck. Passengers retreated to their cabins, while the crew struggled to maintain control. The ship's GPS malfunctioned, its readings fluctuating wildly before shutting down entirely. The captain, a seasoned sailor, was unnerved. He ordered the crew to drop anchor and ride out the storm, but the anchor cable snapped as if something beneath the waves had severed it. With no other option, the Midnight Seraph drifted aimlessly into the storm's heart. By dawn, the storm had abated, but the ship was surrounded by a thick, unnatural fog. The horizon was obscured, and the sea had grown eerily calm. The Midnight Seraph seemed to float in a world of endless white. Passengers, relieved to have survived the night, ventured onto the deck only to find themselves overcome by a strange sense of unease. The air was heavy and cold, and the fog seemed alive, curling and twisting around the ship in serpentine patterns. As the day wore on, strange phenomena began to occur. The ship's clocks all stopped at exactly 11:13 a.m. The radios emitted bursts of static, punctuated by faint, echoing voices. Crew members reported hearing footsteps in empty hallways and seeing shadowy figures just out of the corner of their eyes. That evening, a passenger named Eliza went missing. She had been seen heading to the ship's lounge, but when her husband went to check on her, she was nowhere to be found. Her belongings were still on the table, her book open to a page about seafaring legends. The lounge's windows were open, though no one remembered opening them. A faint trail of seawater led from the window to the floor, ending abruptly. Panic set in. The passengers and crew gathered in the dining hall, but the ship felt larger, the corridors longer than they remembered. It was as if the Midnight Seraph itself was shifting, changing. The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The next disappearance happened during the night. A crew member on watch in the engine room simply vanished. The security camera footage showed him staring at one of the bulkheads before suddenly walking out of frame. His flashlight and tools were left behind, but he was never seen again. By the 5th night, the Midnight Seraph was a floating ghost ship. The fog had infiltrated the interior, seeping through vents and cracks. It carried with it a damp, salty smell and faint whispers that seemed to come from every direction. Some passengers claimed the whispers called their names, pleading with them to come outside. The captain ordered everyone to remain in the dining hall while he and the remaining crew tried to navigate out of the fog. They powered up the engines, but the ship refused to move. It was as if the ocean had turned to molasses, holding the Midnight Seraph in place. The fog began to glow faintly, casting the ship in an otherworldly light. And then the singing began. It was faint at first, a haunting, melodic tune that seemed to come from the sea itself. The passengers covered their ears, but the sound was impossible to block out. It grew louder, more insistent, and with it came an overwhelming compulsion to step outside. One by one, passengers and crew members succumbed, walking toward the deck with glassy eyes. Those who resisted described an unbearable pressure in their skulls, as if the song was burrowing into their minds. The captain was the last to leave the dining hall. He locked the doors behind him, but it didn't matter. The remaining passengers watched through the windows as he approached the ship's edge. He paused, staring into the fog as if seeing something beautiful. Then he stepped over the railing and disappeared. The next morning, the Midnight Seraph was found drifting near the Faroe Islands. The ship was intact, but completely deserted. There was no sign of the passengers or crew. Plates of food were left half-eaten in the dining hall, beds unmade, and the ship's log ended abruptly with the words, "They are calling. We can't resist." The Midnight Seraph was towed back to port, but no company dared to operate it again. It sits abandoned to this day, its once polished decks now covered in rust and grime. Locals claim the ship is cursed, and fishermen avoid the waters where it was found. They say that on foggy nights, you can still hear the faint strains of a song drifting across the waves, a song that promises beauty, peace, and the unknown, if only you'll follow it into the mist.